Alright, I am back again with the lens I made a video on about a week ago. This is the Komura 35mm f2.8 in Nikon S mount. And I have a little viewfinder up here on my Nikon S. And I'm going to do a bit of a preliminary review. Normally I try to wait until I've had the gear for, most of the stuff I've had for probably a year or more. This one I've only had for a couple of weeks now, but I've already put a few rolls of film through it, and I gotta say I was really impressed by the results. And this is also the first time I've really taken the Nikon S out and shot it, so it's kind of a first for both of them. And I was actually quite impressed by both of them. I think I'll start off by quickly talking about the Nikon S. They don't get a lot of love. I've noticed in the Nikon series, the Nikon rangefinder series that is, the S2s seem to get a lot of love, and the SPs, and everybody seems to forget about the S4, and it seems like most people are kind of divisive on the S3 and kind of prefer the SP for its extra little bells and whistles, or they say the S2 is better because it's got a brighter rangefinder patch. And the S's are often overlooked, and they're, I believe, the second most common camera in the lineup, and a lot more common than a lot of the later ones like the S4 and even the SP to a large extent. But they are an older design. They kind of take a lot more from the early Leica Barnix. They have the shutter speeds are kind of weird, and they have the double knobs right here, which when using it, I didn't really find it that annoying. I didn't really use the slow speeds maybe once or twice, so that wasn't a big deal there. And the primary speeds, even though they are kind of irregular, I found them to be pretty useful. And I used the Sekonic meter, and it was pretty easy to figure out what the what the 200 speed would be or the 100 speed. Compared to the more standard 125 or 250th speeds. So that was kind of interesting. The little advanced knob was a bit weird. I don't love it, but I don't hate it. Like I said in my last video, I nicked my finger a little bit on the focusing wheel there. That was kind of annoying. So ever since then I've been kind of careful to hold it from the top or kind of hold it from the side when you're rotating it and trying to advance the film. The rewind knob is the same kind of thing. You have to rewind it manually. It's not as convenient as the ones with the little crank, but it's not too bad to use. It's very well built. It's kind of heavy, quite a bit heavier than the other models, but I kind of like it. That heft just gives it a little bit of weight, and it feels very durable. And I really don't mind it. I'm sure some people complain because it is, compared to a lot of other cameras, it is kind of heavy, but it's not that bad, and it's still pretty small. It fits in the hand pretty easily. You can stuff it into a small camera bag pretty easily. I really like the viewfinder. It's got a lot of contrast to it, more so than most of the later models. I'm sure it's probably pretty equal to something like an S2, but it is kind of impressive because it is pretty easy to focus with. The downside being you only have the 50mm overall frame, so you kind of have to use the accessory finders a lot, which fortunately this lens came with, and I used it quite a bit. I found this finder to be pretty accurate and pretty useful. When it comes to close focusing, it did seem to be a little off, but I might not have remembered to adjust it, or I might not have correctly adjusted it, but it did seem like with some of the close focusing it was a little bit off. The lens was really nice. It is a little, the focusing ring is not quite as loose as a lot of the Nikon ones. If you take it off, you'll see it has a little bit of resistance, whereas most of the Nikon rangefinder ones are a little bit looser. I put a couple of drops of oil in there. I didn't want to go crazy, but I put a little bit, and it seemed to loosen up a tiny bit, but not a whole lot. And I was actually really impressed by this lens. I wasn't expecting a whole lot, but I gotta say, I really liked it. The results I got were very sharp, easily on par with any of the Nikon stuff. The close focus, I used a lot of close focus, did some kind of like portrait work and things, and I was impressed by that. It looked good. And when I used it close up, it produced a really nice bokeh. It had a pretty dramatic depth of field, and the bokeh was always really beautiful. It had just that good classic quality. I'm sure some people would say it's it has a hint of the swirl look to it, like you see in a lot of the older lenses, and I know some people don't like that, but I don't really mind it. I did see when I had it wide open at f2, it did seem like it had a tiny bit of vignetting here and there, and again, it was pretty subtle, but there were a couple of images where it did seem like there was a little bit of vignetting in the corners. I don't really mind that too much. I know some people won't like that. I know some people love that and want crazy vignetting, so I think they found a good balance where there's just enough, you get a little bit of that kind of swirl bokeh, but it's not super overwhelming or really predominant in the images. And same with the vignetting. You get a little bit of vignetting wide open, but it's not too dramatic, and it seems to disappear at f4. It seems like it really only shows up at f2.8, which of course is the fastest aperture. So I didn't really mind that. I found it to be pretty, all in all, just very appealing. I really like the look of it. Like I said, it had a sharp image quality. I think part of it was the fact that it was just a little bit easier to focus with this the really bright contrasty viewfinder, the Nikon S. So I think I might use the S a little bit more. It had a really nice look. I only shot black and white film. That's a disclaimer I'm going to have to point out right there. I'll probably have to come back and do a video with color later on. But I really like the look I got. I used Ultrafine 100. I think that was the only film I used when I did my tests. That was all I really had laying around. And I was really impressed. It had a very high contrast look, and it just always looked good. The exposures were always even, which kind of surprised me because I think the shutter was a little off, but I'll go into that in a minute. For usability, it can be a little bit tough to turn this focusing ring. I think I might just put another drop or two of oil in there just to see what that does. But it was pretty good overall. I did find that, as I kind of anticipated, the little clip right there, it sticks out further than on pretty much any other lens I have, and there were a couple times I'd kind of catch it and it would pull the lens off, kind of like right there. It didn't happen a whole lot, but it did happen a couple of times. So that was something to be mindful of that I didn't particularly love, but it wasn't a huge issue. All in all, I gotta say, I was really impressed by this lens and I want to use it a lot more. I honestly think, I know it's probably a little bit early to say it, but this is probably my favorite 35mm lens I've used so far. And I do have a couple more I've been using and I'm going to do reviews on it later, but it will probably be a couple more weeks. But I was very impressed by this. It had a nice balance of being sharp and just having like good image quality. It had a nice high contrast look, which I wasn't really expecting, but it had some of the more classic stuff. Like it had a dramatic bokeh effect, but it was, I would argue it had kind of a vintage look. I posted some of the images on rangefinder forum, and somebody said it actually had a much more modern rendering than the Nikon lenses. And I don't know, I guess I could kind of see where they're coming from, but I guess it's very subjective because when you talk about the classic Nikon rangefinder lenses, yes, I think this does have a more modern look than the classic true Nikon rangefinder lenses, but actual modern lenses look very different, I think. They don't have quite the character of this lens. And I think it is a lens that has a nice character. It's not like some of those cheap kind of Lomo lenses you see that are just all vignetting, or the ones that just never look very sharp or have a lot of distortion, or they have some crazy bokeh but it looks really choppy and it just doesn't look that good, like a lot of the lenses coming out of China now that have the really fast apertures and they're made in Leica M mount, and they're okay, but they're kind of a beast of themselves. They're kind of a strange little niche where, you know, there's a certain market of people who want that, but probably not everybody. I'm really interested to try this lens out with color film because I believe it's actually multi-coated. I'm just guessing. There's not really any markings to suggest that on here, but it does seem like the coating on the front is pretty strong, and just from looking at it, I think it's multi-coated, and I still haven't found much information on this lens. I looked around, I found there was another post on rangefinder forum where somebody had one of these lenses. I don't know if it was the exact same model or not. I don't think they showed the lens. I think it could have been another Komura 35mm lens. I'm not sure if it was the f2.8 or the 3.5, but I think it was in the Leica screw mount. And they posted a lot of photos, and I saw some of the characteristics in those images that I saw in mine. And they used a lot of color film, and it looked pretty good. Nothing too remarkable, pretty average color film photos, but it looked really nice. I was kind of surprised I missed that one the first time, because it seems like that's the only references to it on rangefinder forum were these two posts. One was from 2015 and I think the other was from 2016, and I was surprised nobody else had really mentioned them since then. I still looked into the company a little bit and I found a little bit of information, but not much, and it seems like the lenses, there's quite a few of them, but it gets confusing because they're in all different mounts. There's a few different lens types, and it's very hard to easily classify them, and it's not too easy to find information on them. But I've been impressed by what I've seen so far, and I am kind of surprised it's not a better known lens because I really liked it. But I look at the serial number, and the serial number ends in 0069. So I wonder, it seems possible this is the 69th lens produced in a limited run that might have only been a few hundred lenses. It's really hard to say, but given the size of the company, the fact that they're pretty small and they're not very well known, I think it's possible that a lot of these lenses were probably produced for a very limited amount of time in very limited runs, and it's possible they made just possibly 200 to 500 of a lot of these lenses, especially the Nikon S mount ones. And as I say that, I have no proof to substantiate that, and I have noticed that the Nikon mount 135mm lenses, which I think are all f3.5s, do seem to be considerably more common than the others. I don't know if that's just because they're less desirable or what, but I have seen a few of those where the 35s are kind of rare. I've only seen a couple in the Nikon S mount, And there's an 80mm f1.8, as I said last time, which is available in Nikon S mount, but I've only seen a couple of those, and they're very expensive. I was also told there's a 105mm lens in the Nikon S mount. I think it was an f2, but I don't quite remember. And I think I saw like one photo of it, but I haven't actually seen any of them for sale or seen a lot of information on them. So it's still really hard to find stuff on this company. And there's not much out there about the lenses either, which is very strange. And like I said, I'm surprised that such an obscure company made such a quality lens and that they're not better known. But I guess that's just one of the mysteries of the ages. I don't know if we'll ever really have an answer. I'll keep looking into it. I actually sent an email to the Nikon Historical Society and was trying to see if they knew anything about them. I'm not sure if a lens that fits Nikon mounts but itself is not Nikon would be something they really follow, but I wouldn't be surprised if some of the members know something about it. But I sent that email about 2 weeks ago and I've gotten no response. I don't know how active the organization is. I know it's a pretty small organization, and I know they actually used to publish a newsletter a while ago, but I don't really think it's been published in a couple of years, so it's possible they're kind of winding down and fading into the ages, which is kind of sad because with the rise of Instagram and the kind of film fads that have been happening over the last couple of years, it seems like the Nikon rangefinders are getting a lot more love and attention now than they were 5 or 10 or even 15 years ago. So it is kind of strange that the Nikon Historical Society seems to be dying, but the cameras seem to be a lot more popular now than they have been in the recent past. But I mean, you know, it's one of those things. There's really no accounting for that. Who knows what's going on there. So I've talked a lot about the lens. I'll definitely include some of the sample photos I took at the end. They are all black and white, which is a bit of a down, but I'll do color later. I'll probably do a whole separate video where I talk about color films on here, and I'll try to shoot a couple of different films. I'll definitely do some Kodak Gold. I have some of that laying around, and I might try to do possibly Ektar. I always like Kodak Ektar and think it's kind of underrated. The one thing I want to talk about is the camera. I was kind of disappointed because when I used it, all in all, the images came out good, but I noticed some of them that I believe were shot at 1/500th of a second because they were outside and it was on a bright day. They seem to have a bit of a gradient to them where one side of the image would be kind of dark and the other would be kind of brighter, and the middle section would be more the exposure I was looking for. And it wasn't horrible, but it was noticeable, especially in the sky. And I was kind of disappointed because I tested the camera using the CRT method I highlight in one of my other videos, and it seemed like it was relatively accurate. I figured it was a bit fast, but I thought it would work. But after seeing those images, I don't think it was very well calibrated, so that's another big disappointment from that repair I sent it off to. So I would strongly suggest against using Portland Camera Repair. I don't think they really did a very good job. I was able to open up the bottom, very similar to the Nikon S3 like I showed in my other video, and repair it. It is a slightly more finicky process because you have to remove these little screws that hold in these gears, and you have to kind of turn the gears, and one of them seemed to be at its max, so I couldn't really turn it anymore, and then I had to put the little screws back in. It was very hard to get them in, and the camera was old and worn. It had obviously, I'm guessing over the years it's probably had multiple CLAs, because even before I sent it in, it had a messed up screw on the bottom, and it looked like the little posts that hold in the little cogs that control the springs, one of them was kind of damaged. So I think this camera was probably sent in for some sort of CLA or adjustment, or probably adjusted at home manually by somebody back, you know, 20 or 30 years ago, and they did not, I say 20, probably 30 or 40 years ago. They probably didn't do a great job. And then it probably kind of compounded some of the problems. And then when I sent it off, I think they kind of did what they could, but I just don't know if they're the best repair guys around. They're not very well known, and I can kind of see why, because the work they did on this camera was, I guess I could say it was passable. Like, they did replace the shutter, but the calibration just wasn't very accurate. I'm still not sure if they really needed to replace the Moroccan leather on here with the vulcanite. I know it's a small thing, but the Moroccan leather on it was in almost perfect condition, which is very rare. Usually they bubble up really bad on the back. They sent the wrong back, which they did fix, and I was glad for that, and they did give me a modest, a decent refund for it, but all in all considered, I really don't think it was worth the money. And it's tricky to say that, because the only other people I could have sent it to, from what I saw, was Kanto Camera, who were going to charge me $600 plus shipping and handling, which seemed pretty insane, especially when you consider that on a good day, this camera body in working order is probably only worth $300 or $400. Add a lens to it, usually a 50mm, and it's worth maybe $500. Maybe if you really want to push it, if it's in really good condition, maybe $600 or $700. but that would probably be including like the case in decent shape and maybe the original box or manual or something like that. So I'm really not sure it would have been worth it at that point. So I still feel like I found an okay middle ground, but I would say that if you have a Nikon rangefinder to repair, you might want to spend that extra money and send it back to Japan, because they made them there and they seem to know how to take care of them. Sadly, it doesn't seem like a lot of people are willing or able to repair these cameras anymore. I think part of that is just the fact that they're getting so old. I mean, this camera was probably made in like 1948, maybe 1949, so it's pretty old. It's I said 48 and 48. Yeah, it was probably around 48 or 49. I looked at the serial number and I can't quite remember now, because I guess that would probably be the production line of more of an M. So it could have been the early 50s, but anyways, it's very old. This camera's a lot older than me. It's older than my parents. It's something that my grandparents would have bought when they were pretty young. So, I mean, you got to think, this camera probably has outlived its expected lifespan by a solid 30 or 40 years. I don't know if anybody would have really imagined these cameras being in use up to the year 2000, let alone in 2021. So I can't fault them too much, because I don't know who owned this camera before me. I bought it in a little pawn shop in, not a pawn shop, a sort of an antique store in Florida. I think it was around Pensacola, Florida. I would have assumed it probably belonged to a service member, but it doesn't seem to have any sort of EP marking on it. So I don't, if that was the case, they definitely bought it in the US and not in Japan. But it seemed like it was possible it could have belonged to a service member who carried it around for a while. I think it was probably used pretty heavily, because you can see there's a lot of scuff marks around the film advance lever and the film rewind lever. So I think it was used pretty heavily and probably carried around a lot. It still had the case. It was a little beat up, but not in the worst condition. I've seen ones in far worse condition. But it is interesting, because it kind of makes me want to know who owned this camera, but that doesn't really matter right now. I'm supposed to be talking about this lens. But yeah, to kind of finish things off and try to get back to where I started, I was really impressed by this lens. When I bought it, I don't know what I was expecting. I don't think I was expecting it to be anything great. I think I was expecting something, you might argue, kind of an effect lens with some character, or maybe kind of a, not quite a Lomo lens, but just, it's kind of hard to explain. But if you know vintage camera lenses, you know there's certain old lenses that are known for having interesting effects, like really dramatic bokeh, really dramatic flare, things like that some people might not immediately consider desirable, but if you use them correctly, they can really be quite fascinating. And I think I was kind of expecting this out of this lens, and probably not expecting it to be too sharp or too phenomenal, but I was impressed, because it is very sharp. I would say it's easily on par with the Nikons. And I think its depth of field, it seems like it pulls a better depth of field than the Nikon 35s, which kind of surprised me, since its aperture is a little bit lower. I don't know, its minimum focusing distance might be a tiny bit closer than the Nikon's, but that's pretty debatable. It's probably just a very small amount if it is. But I was very impressed. And again, I'm really shocked there isn't more about the lens out there, and that more people aren't looking for them. I mean, maybe there is some secret cult of people out there who would love and worship this lens, and they buy them all up and hoard them somewhere, and maybe that's why they're so hard to find. But that seems a little bit implausible, because it seems like somewhere there'd be a Instagram group, or a Flickr group, or some sort of website, or a bunch of pages on a forum that, you know, go on about this lens and talk about how great it is. Because whenever people find something nice, they seem to love talking about it and flaunting it everywhere, and there's very little out there on this lens. But I guess my recommendation would be, if you see one of these lenses, buy it. I've seen some of them on eBay running around $600. At that point, I would say maybe not worth it. But if you can get one in the $300 or even $400 range, I think it's very worth it, because it is easily on par with most of the Nikon stuff. And I say that knowing there's a lot of Nikon 35mm lenses, and that the Nikon 28mm lens is technically the same formula. So it's kind of a loaded question, but I would say that, yeah, it's a very good lens. And if you like a 35mm lens, I would definitely try to look into picking one of these up. It's really fascinating. I think this is going to become one of my favorite lenses from now on. I know that's kind of subjective. I think I've said that a couple of times before about the Nikon 28 and the Nikon 85, and in retrospect I look at the 85 and I'm like, yeah, the 85 does have a really nice rendition, but I don't take it out and use it all that much, so what does that really count for? I like the 50s a lot. Those are good lenses. They're just solid workhorse lenses. There's not really any problems with them. They look good. They've got a nice bokeh. But this lens just has a little something extra. It's sharp. It just has a nice, it looked really great. The black and white film just came out with such a great contrast. And I think some of that was the film and developer I was using. I used I used the Photo Warehouse Ultrafine Extreme 100, and I developed it in Ilford Ilsol 3, which I think it's one of my favorite developers. I know some people say it's kind of overpriced, but I don't think it's really that much more expensive than most of the other ones. And I think it always gives good results that have a little bit more contrast. I was kind of disappointed because, as I said in my previous video, I bought another 100-foot roll of Ultrafine Extreme 100, and it kind of looks like they're phasing out the Ultrafine Extreme line and going with some other Ultrafine Premium line that is still about in the same price range, but I think it is a somewhat different film stock, so I'm gonna have to try that out at some point in the future. That'll probably be like a year down the road at this point, because I got a whole bunch of 100 I got to work through. But I'll be interested to see how that works out. I hope they keep the Extreme line around, but I wouldn't keep my fingers crossed at this point. But all in all, yeah, very nice lens. Nice experience shooting it on this camera. And now that I've used it some, I think the shutter, I recalibrated it, like I said. I think it should be a little bit more accurate. I did do at least one test roll, and it seemed like the gradient got a little bit less defined. I think it's still there a little bit, but not quite as well defined. But at the end of the day, when we work this old camera gear, you kind of have to expect that stuff. Because even when this camera was made brand new in the late 40s or early 50s, it probably wouldn't have had a shutter that was 100% accurate. I mean, you have to think, from what I understand, Nikon for a while made their cameras in essentially like a Quonset hut with a dirt floor because they grew so quickly. They had a big brick building that was part of their factory where they made the lenses, and they had to kind of move stuff out into a yard or parking lot and make stuff there. So it's kind of fascinating they were able to make this stuff at all, and on the scale they were able to. When you consider how little they had to work with in post-war Japan, and what an obscure company they were outside of Japan. Like, nobody really knew about them. So again, it's kind of a blessing that this camera is even still in working order. And I know I keep harping on about that, but it is interesting because, I mean, you have to wonder, did anybody think these cameras would be in use for so long? Because there's a good chance this camera will be in use when it's 100 years old, and that's kind of crazy when you think about it. If I have anything to do with it, I'll try to keep it that way and keep it in working order to its 100th birthday. I don't know if that'll happen. I'll try. I don't know if it's going to be worth the money if I have to send it in for another repair or CLA or something, but it would be kind of interesting to see that happen. So I've ran it on for a while. I'll just pause right here, and I'll show some of the photos I took with this lens, and I'll let you judge for yourself.